The darkness wrapped around Alexander's car like a heavy blanket as he navigated the winding forest road. His headlights cut through the thick night air, illuminating nothing but endless trees and the occasional reflective eyes of nocturnal animals. The wedding had been beautiful, one of those rare moments when his demanding career as a successful attorney took second place to personal connections. His best friend from law school had finally married his college sweetheart, and Alexander had been honored to serve as best man. Now, at nearly midnight, exhaustion weighed on his shoulders. The champagne had worn off hours ago, replaced by the familiar tension that came from too many late nights and too much responsibility. He rolled down the window, letting the cool mountain air fill his lungs. The forest smelled of pine and damp earth, a welcome change from the sterile air of conference rooms and courthouses. Just as he was beginning to relax into the rhythm of the drive, his headlights swept across something that made him slam on the brakes. There, on the rocky shoulder of the road, sat a figure hunched against the darkness. Alexander's heart hammered as he pulled over, his legal mind immediately calculating risks. This wasn't exactly the safest stretch of highway, and picking up strangers was something his mother had warned him against since childhood. But as his headlights illuminated the figure more clearly, he saw it was a young black woman, maybe in her late 20s, sitting with her arms wrapped around her knees. Her posture spoke of defeat and desperation in a way that cut through his caution like a blade. She didn't even look up when his car stopped, as if she had given up hope that anyone would care enough to notice her. Alexander stepped out slowly, his expensive leather shoes crunching on the gravel. The woman finally raised her head, and what he saw made his chest tighten with sympathy. Her face was streaked with tears that had carved clean tracks through dust and grime. Her clothes were rumpled and dirty, her hair disheveled, as if she had been running or walking for hours. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. They held a depth of pain and fear that spoke of experiences no person should endure. "Excuse me," he called out gently, maintaining a respectful distance. "Are you all right? Do you need help?" She flinched at his voice, and for a moment he thought she might run. Instead, she stared at him with a mixture of wariness and desperate hope. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, cracked with exhaustion and emotion. "I don't know what to do," she said, the words tumbling out like a dam breaking. "My husband, he just left me here, told me to figure it out myself, and drove away." The casual cruelty of it hit Alexander like a physical blow. He had seen enough domestic cases to recognize the signs of abuse, the particular kind of emotional destruction that came from intimate betrayal. This woman wasn't just stranded, she was shattered. "What's your name?" he asked, crouching down to meet her at eye level while still keeping his distance. "Martha," she replied, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "Martha Jennings." "I'm Alexander," he said. "Martha, I know this might sound strange, but I have a guest room at my house about 20 minutes from here. You're welcome to stay the night. Get cleaned up, figure out your next steps in the morning. No strings attached, I promise." Martha's eyes widened with surprise and suspicion. In her experience, strangers didn't offer help without expecting something in return. But something in Alexander's voice, maybe the genuine concern in his eyes, made her consider it. "Why would you do that for someone like me?" she asked, the question loaded with implications about race and class that hung heavy in the night air. Alexander felt the weight of her question. He could have given her a dozen reasons: his legal training, his sense of civic duty, his mother's lessons about treating others with dignity. Instead, he simply said, "Because everyone deserves help when they need it most." The drive to his house was quiet, filled with the kind of tension that comes when two strangers navigate the delicate balance of trust and vulnerability. Martha sat rigidly in the passenger seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, stealing glances at Alexander as if trying to read his intentions. When they arrived at his modest but comfortable home, Alexander showed her to the guest room, provided fresh towels, and offered to make her something to eat. She accepted with a quiet dignity that impressed him, though he could see the exhaustion weighing on every movement. As he lay in his own bed that night, Alexander couldn't shake the image of Martha's tear-streaked face or the hopelessness in her voice. Something told him there was much more to her story than a cruel husband's abandonment. The thought followed him into restless sleep, where dreams of courtrooms and injustice swirled together with the memory of desperate eyes asking for help in the darkness. Dawn crept through the windows of Alexander's house with unusual quietness. He had left early for the office, slipping out before 7 to give Martha privacy and time to rest. His mind was already working on practical solutions. Maybe his friend at social services could help her find temporary housing, or perhaps there were job openings at firms that needed administrative support. He had handled enough pro bono cases to know the system, and Martha seemed like someone who just needed a fair chance. Martha, however, was far from the peaceful sleep Alexander imagined. She sat on the edge of the guest bed, her body trembling with anxiety that had nothing to do with the cool morning air. The clean sheets and comfortable room felt like a cruel mockery of the storm that was about to break over her life. She knew they would find her eventually. They always did. Her son's face flashed through her mind. Sweet Tommy, with his bright smile and endless questions, lying in that hospital bed, connected to machines that beeped and hummed with mechanical precision. The medical bills had piled up like a mountain of accusation, each one stamped with amounts that might as well have been written in a foreign language for all the hope she had of paying them. The knock came at 10:30 a.m., sharp and authoritative in a way that made Martha's blood turn to ice. She peered through the curtain and saw exactly what she had expected. 2 police officers standing on the front porch, their hands resting casually on their weapons, their faces set in expressions of professional indifference. "Police, open up." The voice boomed through the house with an authority that brooked no argument. Alexander had left the door unlocked in his rush to get to the office, a small kindness that now felt like a trap closing around Martha. The officers didn't wait for permission. Heavy boots stomped across the hardwood floors as they made their way through the house, calling out locations like soldiers clearing a battlefield. When they found her in the guest room, their expressions hardened with the particular kind of disdain reserved for people they had already decided were guilty. "Martha Jennings," the first officer barked, his hand moving to his holster. "You're under arrest for the armed robbery of Crescent Bank. Turn around and put your hands where I can see them." "I didn't hurt anyone," Martha stammered, raising her trembling hands. "Please, just let me explain." "Save it for the judge," the second officer snapped, roughly spinning her around and forcing her arms behind her back. The handcuffs clicked shut with a finality that seemed to echo through the room. As they marched her through the house, the officers couldn't resist adding their own commentary to the arrest. "Did you really think you could hide out in some lawyer's fancy house?" one sneered. "You people always think you're smarter than the system." The phrase "you people" hit Martha like a slap. She had heard it countless times throughout her life, always delivered with the same mixture of contempt and assumption. It was the shorthand for a dozen ugly stereotypes, the casual racism that turned individual circumstances into collective guilt. Outside, a small crowd had gathered. Neighbors drawn by the commotion whispered among themselves, their voices carrying clearly in the morning air. "I knew something was off about her," an elderly woman said to her husband. "These people, they always bring trouble wherever they go." A man in an expensive suit nodded knowingly, another one thinking she can get away with whatever she wants. Thank goodness they caught her before she could do more damage. Martha kept her head down as they shoved her into the back of the police car, trying to block out the voices and stares. But the shame burned through her like acid, mixing with her fear to create a toxic cocktail of despair. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. She was supposed to have more time. At the police station, the processing was methodical and dehumanizing. Fingerprints, mugshots, invasive searches that stripped away what little dignity she had left. The officers treated her like a piece of evidence rather than a human being, their casual cruelty a reminder of how easily people could be reduced to their worst moments. Meanwhile, Alexander returned home to find his house eerily quiet and obviously disturbed. The guest room showed signs of a struggle: rumpled bedding, a overturned water glass, the lingering smell of fear and desperation. His heart sank as he realized what had happened. He immediately called Detective Reynolds, an old friend from his early days practicing criminal law. "Dave, did you pick up a woman from my house this morning?" "Martha Jennings." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Jesus, Alex, what were you thinking? Do you have any idea who that woman is? I know she's someone who needed help, Alexander replied, his voice tight with anger. Now tell me what's going on. She robbed Crescent Bank, took $50,000. That's serious money, Alex. Serious time if she's convicted. Alexander felt the world shift beneath his feet. $50,000? The broken woman he had found by the roadside didn't seem capable of such a crime. Something didn't add up. I'm coming down to the station, he told Reynolds, and I'm representing her. Alex, be careful. Getting involved in this could hurt your reputation. This isn't some white-collar case you can smooth over with charm and precedent. But Alexander had already made up his mind. The woman who had sat in his guest room, broken and afraid, deserved better than the system's casual assumption of guilt. She deserved someone who would fight for the truth, whatever that truth might be. The police station felt like a fortress of institutional indifference as Alexander strode through its sterile corridors. His tailored suit and confident bearing commanded immediate attention from the desk officers, but he could see the skepticism in their eyes. Why would a successful attorney want to represent someone like Martha Jennings? The interrogation room was exactly what he expected. Stark walls, fluorescent lighting that drained the life out of everything it touched, and a metal table scarred by years of desperate conversations. Martha sat hunched in her chair, her wrists still bearing the red marks from the handcuffs. When she looked up at Alexander, her eyes held a mixture of gratitude and defeat that cut him to the core. They think I'm a monster, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the air conditioning. The way they looked at me, talked about me, like I'm not even human. Alexander sat across from her, his expression gentle but focused. I need you to tell me everything, Martha. Not the version you think I want to hear, but the truth, all of it. Martha's story unfolded like a tragedy in slow motion. She had worked at Crescent Bank for 3 years, putting in long hours for modest pay, trying to build something stable for herself and her son. Tommy was 8 years old, born with a rare genetic condition that required constant medical attention and experimental treatments that insurance companies viewed as elective. When Tommy got worse last month, I went to my manager, Martha explained, her hands twisting together on the table. Mr. Richardson, I begged him for an advance on my salary, or maybe a loan through the bank's employee program. I had worked overtime for months without complaint, never missed a day even when I was sick myself. Alexander leaned forward, sensing the crucial details were coming. He laughed at me, Martha continued, her voice hardening with remembered humiliation. Said people like me needed to learn responsibility, that handouts wouldn't solve my problems. He made it clear that my job was hanging by a thread, that single mothers with complications weren't the image the bank wanted to project. The casual cruelty of it made Alexander's jaw clench. He had seen enough workplace discrimination to recognize the subtle language of bias, the way prejudice dressed itself up in corporate speak. So you took the money, Alexander said, not as a question but as a statement of understanding. Martha nodded, tears beginning to stream down her cheeks. I waited until after hours, when the cleaning crew was there but the office was mostly empty. I had access to the cash reserves because of my position. But I swear to you, I only took what I needed for Tommy's treatment. Maybe $3,000, not a penny more. Alexander's mind raced. 3,000 versus 50,000 was a massive discrepancy. Either Martha was lying to minimize her crime, or someone else was manipulating the numbers. Over the next few days, Alexander threw himself into the investigation with the intensity of a man possessed. He started with the bank security footage, only to discover that most of it was conveniently corrupted or missing. The cameras that should have captured Martha's actions had mysteriously malfunctioned that night. But Alexander hadn't built his reputation by accepting easy answers. He dug deeper into Crescent Bank's financial records, using his legal connections to obtain warrants for documents that the bank would have preferred to keep buried. What he found was a pattern of discrepancies that painted a very different picture of the crime. For months leading up to Martha's alleged theft, money had been disappearing from various accounts in small amounts, the kind of systematic embezzlement that required inside knowledge and administrative access. The thefts were sophisticated, designed to avoid detection by spreading the losses across multiple departments and time frames. Alexander's private investigator, a former police detective named Sarah Chun, uncovered even more damaging evidence. Richardson, Martha's manager, had been living well above his salary for the past year. New cars, expensive vacations, a second mortgage on a house that should have been beyond his means. He's been skimming for months, Sarah reported during one of their late-night strategy sessions. Martha just gave him the perfect scapegoat. Young black woman with financial problems and access to the cash. Who's the jury going to believe? But the smoking gun came from an unexpected source. Deep in the bank's digital storage system, Alexander found security footage from a camera that had been overlooked in the initial investigation. Hidden in the corner of the vault area, it captured everything that happened the night of Martha's desperate act. The footage was damning, but not in the way the prosecution expected. It showed Martha entering the vault area, taking a small stack of bills, and leaving within minutes. Her movements were quick, but not furtive. More like someone grabbing a lifeline than someone committing a calculated crime. But then, nearly an hour later, Richardson appeared on the same camera. He moved with the confidence of someone who belonged there, systematically adding stacks of cash to various locations throughout the vault. The man who had refused to help a desperate mother was literally adding money to the crime scene to inflate the charges against her. Alexander felt a cold rage settle in his chest as he watched the footage. This wasn't just about a theft anymore. It was about a system that was so eager to destroy a vulnerable woman that it had overlooked obvious evidence of corruption in its own ranks. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Morrison, seemed supremely confident in their case. They had a confession of sorts. Martha admitted to taking money. They had motive, her son's medical bills. They had opportunity, her access to the bank's cash reserves. What they didn't have was the complete picture, and they seemed disinterested in finding it. But Alexander was just getting started. He had built his career on cases that others thought were unwinnable, and Martha Jennings was about to become his most important victory. The system had failed her at every turn, but he wouldn't. Not this time. The courthouse buzzed with an energy that felt more like a sporting event than a search for justice. Reporters clustered around the entrance, their cameras hungry for any glimpse of the woman who had become the face of urban crime in the local media. Headlines had painted Martha as everything from a desperate bank robber to a welfare queen gone wrong, each story more sensational than the last. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with tension and expectation. The gallery was packed with curious onlookers, court watchers, and reporters scribbling notes for their evening broadcasts. At the prosecution table, District Attorney Morrison sat with the confidence of a man who had never lost a case this straightforward. His evidence was solid, his witnesses reliable, and his defendant fit perfectly into the narrative that juries love to believe. Martha sat at the defense table, wearing a borrowed suit that Alexander had arranged for her, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked smaller than she had in his guest room that first night, diminished by weeks of jail and the constant weight of public judgment. But there was something new in her eyes, not hope exactly, but a quiet determination that hadn't been there before. Alexander had spent countless hours preparing for this moment. His closing argument was memorized, his cross-examinations planned to the smallest detail, his evidence organized with the precision of a military campaign. But as he looked at the jury, he felt the familiar weight of an uphill battle. 12 faces, mostly white, mostly middle class, mostly inclined to believe that people like Martha brought their troubles on themselves. District Attorney Morrison opened with theatrical flair, painting a picture of premeditated crime that would have made Martha sound like a criminal mastermind if it weren't so obviously exaggerated. He gestured dramatically as he spoke, his voice carrying the righteous indignation of a man defending society against its predators. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Morrison began, his voice booming across the courtroom, "we are here today because the defendant, Martha Jennings, made a choice. Not a desperate choice, not a momentary lapse in judgment, but a calculated decision to steal $50,000 from the bank that trusted her, the institution that gave her a chance when others might not have." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "The defense will try to make you feel sorry for her. They'll talk about her sick child, her financial struggles, her difficult circumstances. But I ask you to remember that millions of parents face hardships without turning to crime. Millions of people struggle with medical bills without betraying their employer's trust. Morrison's opening was masterful in its simplicity. He acknowledged Martha's humanity while systematically dismantling any claim to sympathy, presenting her as someone who had been given opportunities and had chosen to abuse them. But when Alexander stood to present his opening statement, the atmosphere in the room shifted. His presence commanded attention in a way that had nothing to do with theatrical gestures and everything to do with quiet authority. He walked slowly to the jury box, making eye contact with each juror before speaking. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alexander began, his voice calm and measured, "by the end of this trial, you will know that Martha Jennings is not the criminal in this courtroom. You will see evidence that has been deliberately hidden from you. Hear testimony that exposes a conspiracy designed to destroy an innocent woman's life, and witness the real face of corruption at Crescent Bank." He turned slightly to gesture toward Martha, his expression softening. Martha Jennings is a mother who made a desperate choice to save her dying child's life. She took $3,000, not $50,000, and she took it only after being denied help by the very man who has been systematically stealing from the bank for months. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Alexander had just made a claim that would require extraordinary evidence to support. The prosecution's case proceeded exactly as expected. They called Richardson to the stand, where he testified with the wounded dignity of a man betrayed by someone he had tried to help. He painted Martha as a manipulative employee who had taken advantage of his trust, someone who had shown no remorse for her actions. "She came to me asking for money," Richardson testified, his voice heavy with disappointment. "I explained our policies, tried to help her find legitimate resources for her situation. But she wouldn't listen. She felt entitled to take what wasn't hers." Under Morrison's questioning, Richardson came across as a dedicated manager who had been victimized by an employee he had tried to support. It was a compelling narrative, supported by bank records, that showed the missing $50,000 and Martha's access to the area where it had been stored. But Alexander's cross-examination was a surgical dismantling of Richardson's testimony. With the patience of a master craftsman, he began to expose the inconsistencies in Richardson's story, the gaps in his timeline, and the suspicious improvements in his financial situation. "Mr. Richardson," Alexander began, his tone conversational, "you testified that you tried to help Martha find legitimate resources for her son's medical bills. Can you tell the jury what specific resources you recommended?" Richardson hesitated. "Well, there are various programs, employee assistance funds, that sort of thing." "I see. And did you provide her with applications for these programs? Contact information? Any documentation of your efforts to help?" It was a verbal conversation. I didn't think to document every detail. Alexander smiled slightly. "How considerate of you. Now, Mr. Richardson, can you explain to the jury how your salary of $45,000 per year has allowed you to purchase a new BMW, take 3 expensive vacations, and make improvements to your home, totaling over $30,000 in the past year?" The question hit the courtroom like a thunderbolt. Morrison jumped to his feet with an objection, but the damage was done. The jury was now looking at Richardson with new suspicion. But the real bombshell came when Alexander presented the hidden security footage. The courtroom fell silent as the video played, showing Martha's brief visit to the vault, followed by Richardson's much longer session of moving money around. The visual evidence was undeniable and devastating. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alexander said as the footage ended, "you have just witnessed the real crime. Martha Jennings took $3,000 in a moment of desperation to save her child. But Mr. Richardson has been systematically stealing from Crescent Bank for months, and when Martha's actions gave him the perfect opportunity to cover his tracks, he framed an innocent woman for his crimes." The prosecution tried to recover, but the evidence was overwhelming. When Alexander called his final witness, a forensic accountant who had traced Richardson's embezzlement through months of bank records, the case was effectively over. In his closing argument, Alexander spoke directly to the jury's sense of justice and humanity. "Martha Jennings stands before you today not as a criminal, but as a victim A victim of a system that failed her when she needed help. A victim of prejudice that made her an easy target. And a victim of corruption that sought to destroy her life to cover its own crimes. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned with a verdict of not guilty, Martha collapsed in tears at the defense table. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of cheers and shocked murmurs as the reality of the verdict sank in. But Alexander's work was far from over. As Richardson was led away in handcuffs, charged with embezzlement and conspiracy, Alexander was already planning the next phase of Martha's fight, not just for her freedom, but for her dignity and her future. The weeks following Martha's acquittal brought a whirlwind of change that neither she nor Alexander could have anticipated. The case had captured national attention, transforming from a local bank robbery trial into a symbol of systemic injustice and the power of determined advocacy. News outlets that had initially painted Martha as a criminal now scrambled to tell her story of redemption, while legal experts praised Alexander's masterful handling of a case that had seemed impossible to win. But for Martha, the victory felt almost too large to comprehend. She sat in Alexander's office 3 days after the trial, still struggling to believe that the nightmare was finally over. The charges had been dropped, Richardson was facing serious jail time for his crimes, and the bank had quietly settled a civil lawsuit that would more than cover Tommy's medical expenses. "I keep expecting someone to tell me it was all a mistake," Martha said, her voice still carrying traces of the fear that had defined her life for so long. "That they're going to arrest me again, that the jury was wrong." Alexander leaned back in his chair, studying her with the careful attention that had made him such an effective attorney. The transformation in Martha was remarkable. The broken woman he had found by the roadside had been replaced by someone stronger, more confident, but also more aware of the fragility of justice. "The system failed you in every way possible," Alexander said quietly. "Your employer, the police, the prosecutors, they all saw what they expected to see instead of looking for the truth. But that's over now. You're free, and more importantly, you have the resources to build the life you and Tommy deserve." The media attention had brought unexpected benefits. Donations poured in from across the country. People moved by Martha's story and Tommy's medical struggles. A children's hospital in the state capital had offered to provide Tommy's treatment at no cost, using his case to advance research into his rare condition. Job offers came from companies eager to associate themselves with Martha's story of perseverance and dignity. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in how Martha saw herself. The woman who had once felt invisible and powerless now understood that her story mattered, that her fight for justice had resonated with people she would never meet. She had become more than a victim. She had become a symbol of resilience. "I want to go back to school," Martha told Alexander during one of their meetings. "Study law, maybe. I want to help people who are going through what I went through." Alexander smiled, recognizing in Martha the same passion for justice that had driven his own career. "I think that's an excellent idea. I know several programs that would be perfect for someone with your experience and perspective." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on Alexander's office door. Sarah Chun, the private investigator who had been instrumental in uncovering the evidence that freed Martha, stepped inside with a folder in her hand and a grim expression on her face. "We need to talk," Sarah said, glancing meaningfully at Martha. "About Richardson and the bank." Alexander gestured for both women to sit. Over the past weeks, Sarah had continued investigating Crescent Bank's operations, suspecting that Richardson's embezzlement was part of a larger pattern of corruption. What she had discovered was even worse than they had imagined. Richardson wasn't working alone, Sarah explained, opening her folder to reveal financial documents and photographs. The bank's senior management knew about the missing money for months. They were using employees like Martha as scapegoats to cover systematic theft by their own executives. The implications were staggering. Martha's case wasn't an isolated incident of injustice. It was part of a deliberate strategy to sacrifice vulnerable employees to protect the bank's leadership. Other cases began to surface. Other employees who had been quietly fired or prosecuted for crimes they hadn't committed. Alexander felt a familiar fire building in his chest, the same rage that had driven him to fight for Martha, now expanding to encompass a much larger battle. "We're going to expose all of it," he said firmly. "Every case, every cover-up, every life they tried to destroy." Martha looked between Alexander and Sarah, understanding dawning in her eyes. "You want me to help, don't you? To be part of taking them down?" "Only if you're ready," Alexander replied. "You've been through enough. No one would blame you for walking away and focusing on your family." But Martha was already shaking her head. "I can't walk away. Not when I know there are other people out there going through what I went through. If my story can help them, then I have to tell it." The class action lawsuit that followed became one of the largest banking fraud cases in the state's history. Martha's testimony was devastating in its simplicity and power, her presence in the courtroom a living reminder of the human cost of corporate corruption. Other victims came forward, their stories forming a pattern of abuse that shocked even experienced legal observers. The case dragged on for months, but the outcome was never in doubt. The evidence was overwhelming, the pattern of corruption undeniable. Crescent Bank faced hundreds of millions in fines and settlements. Its executives were criminally prosecuted, and its business practices became a case study in corporate malfeasance. For Martha, the victory was deeply personal. She had not only cleared her own name, but had become an advocate for others who had been silenced by systems designed to protect the powerful. She testified before legislative committees, spoke at law schools, and worked with civil rights organizations to reform banking practices and police procedures. 2 years after that night, when Alexander found her by the roadside, Martha graduated from law school with honors. Tommy, healthy and thriving thanks to the treatment his mother's fight had secured, watched from the audience as she walked across the stage to receive her diploma. Alexander, sitting in the front row, felt a pride that went beyond professional satisfaction. He had saved more than Martha's freedom that night. He had helped her discover her own power to change the world. At the graduation reception, Martha approached Alexander with tears in her eyes and a smile that lit up her entire face. "Thank you," she said simply, "for seeing me when I was invisible, for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself, for showing me that justice isn't just something that happens to other people." Alexander shook his head, his own eyes moist with emotion. "You did this, Martha. All I did was make sure your voice was heard. The courage, the determination, the refusal to give up, that was all you." As the evening wound down and the last guests departed, Alexander and Martha stood together on the law school steps, looking out at a city that had witnessed their unlikely partnership transform from a chance encounter into a movement for justice. "What's next?" Alexander asked. Martha smiled, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the city lights met the star-filled sky. "We keep fighting," she said, "for everyone who needs someone to see them, to believe in them, to remind them that their story matters." And in that moment, both of them knew that their work was just beginning. The woman Alexander had found broken by the roadside had become a force for justice, and together they would continue to prove that sometimes the most powerful changes come from the most unexpected places. The story that had begun with a simple act of kindness had become something larger, a testament to the power of human dignity, the importance of fighting for truth, and the remarkable things that can happen when someone refuses to let injustice have the final word. If this story moved you, share it with others. Sometimes the most important battles for justice begin with a single person willing to stop and help a stranger in need. Together, we can create a world where everyone's story matters and everyone deserves to be seen.